The light in my late husband's office flickered for 18 months, trying to speak for the dead. Then the electrician called and whispered, "There is a room hidden inside the wall, and I think your husband knew someone would kill him." I went home to rip the truth out of the plaster. The terrifying part was not what Nolan left behind. It was that someone else had already come looking for it. My name is Faith Stewart. At 39 years old, I had built my entire life around the unshakable belief that numbers do not lie. As a forensic accountant at Halcyon Forensic Advisory, my days were spent unearthing the financial sins of powerful people. I tracked offshore accounts, untangled corporate shell companies, and followed the money until it led to the naked truth. Logic, rigid rules, and cold hard data were my religion. I did not believe in ghosts, and I certainly did not believe in mysteries that could not be solved by a thorough, merciless audit. It was 2:47 in the afternoon, and I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor. I was in the middle of breaking down a complex, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme for a sweating, red-faced client when my phone began to vibrate violently against the polished mahogany table. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller ID read Caleb Mercer. Caleb was the electrician I had hired earlier that morning. His only job was to fix the flickering ceiling light in my late husband's home office. For 18 long months, that damn light had sputtered, died, and flared back to life at random intervals. It was as if the house itself was struggling to maintain a desperate connection to a man who was no longer there. I had nearly let the phone ring through to voicemail. I raised my index finger to politely pause my client's panicked rambling, fully intending to press the decline button. Then the screen flashed with a text message. "Urgent. Come home now. Come alone." The blood in my veins turned instantly to ice. The sprawling views of the city skyline, the anxious client, the meticulous spreadsheet spread across the table, everything dissolved into a low, rushing roar in my ears. I stood up, excusing myself with a bluntness that shattered every rule of corporate etiquette, and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. My hands were shaking as I hit the callback button. He answered on the very first ring. "Caleb, what exactly is going on?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady and professional. "Ms. Stewart," he whispered. The sound of his voice made my breath catch in my throat. It was entirely wrong. It lacked the steady, working-class confidence he had carried into my house just 4 hours ago. His tone was thin, breathless, and soaked in raw terror. "There is a void behind the drywall." Caleb breathed into the receiver. "A hidden space. You need to get here right now. I am not saying another word on this phone." The line went dead with a sharp click. I did not go back into the conference room to collect my briefcase. I grabbed my trench coat from the lobby, walked straight out of the building, and drove toward Port Sentinel. Under normal circumstances, the drive out to the coast took 45 minutes. I made it in under 30. My knuckles were white as bone, gripping the leather steering wheel, my foot heavy on the accelerator. Port Sentinel was a wealthy coastal enclave, a place where dark money washed over the shoreline like the tide, burying ugly secrets deep beneath manicured lawns and gated driveways. My house sat quietly at the end of a private cul-de-sac, its large bay windows staring blindly out at the churning gray water of the Atlantic. I pushed the heavy oak front door open, and the absolute silence of the empty house hit me like a physical blow. I had barely touched Nolan's office since the day he died. I had left his silver pens exactly where they lay on the blotter. His leather-bound notebooks remained stacked in their familiar, slightly crooked piles. The thin layer of dust settling over his mahogany desk felt like a sacred shroud to me, a physical manifestation of my enduring grief. Walking into that room felt like trespassing. Touching anything felt like an active erasure of the man I loved. Now. I walked down the long hallway with heavy, deliberate steps, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Caleb was standing dead center in the dimly lit office, The heavy brass light fixture had been completely detached and lowered to the floor, leaving a jagged, dark hole in the ceiling and exposing a thick tangle of dead wires. But Caleb was not looking up at his handiwork. He was staring straight ahead at the far wall, his face the sickly color of old parchment. "Show me," I said. My voice was barely a rasp. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and pointed a trembling finger at the solid expanse of plaster. At first glance, it looked perfectly normal, just a smooth wall painted in a soft, neutral gray. But as my eyes adjusted to the heavy shadows of the room, I finally saw it. There was a hairline fracture in the paint. It ran perfectly vertical from the edge of the oak floorboard straight up to the crown molding. It was a seam so thin, so flawlessly integrated into the architecture, that a normal person could live in this room for 10 years and never once notice it. Caleb took a hesitant step forward and pressed both of his hands against a specific, unmarked section of the drywall. There was a heavy, dull click. The solid wall shifted inward by a fraction of an inch, and then swung smoothly open on hidden, entirely silent hinges. A gust of stale, trapped air brushed against my face, smelling of hot dust, a sharp metallic tang, and old paper. Behind the plaster was not just an empty void between the wooden studs. It was a meticulously constructed, narrow cavity, extending almost 3 feet deep into what should have been solid architecture. A battery-powered LED strip clicked on automatically the moment the panel swung wide, casting a harsh, sterile, white glow over the hidden compartment. My breath completely abandoned me. I stepped past Caleb, my shoes scuffing loudly against the hardwood floor, and stood on the threshold of my dead husband's secret world. On the floor of the cavity sat a heavy, fireproof combination safe and a large plastic file box overflowing with manila folders. But it was the back wall of the compartment that stole the air from my lungs and sent a violent tremor through my hands. It was covered, edge to edge, in thick corkboard. Pinned to the cork was a chaotic, dense, terrifying web of information. There were dozens of surveillance photographs, complex municipal blueprints, electrical schematics, and intricate financial maps drawn in Nolan's distinct, hurried handwriting. Thick strands of red yarn crisscrossed the board, connecting the faces of prominent local politicians to offshore bank accounts, and tying legitimate corporate logos to condemned construction sites. It was the manic, desperate work of a man who was hunting a monster in the dark. Right in the dead center of it all, suspended at eye level on a single silver pushpin, was a plain white envelope. My name was written across the front in black ink. Faith. My hands shook violently as I reached out and pulled the envelope free. The paper felt heavy in my grasp, loaded with a truth I was entirely unprepared to carry. I tore the flap open, my fingernail catching and tearing the thick paper, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. The handwriting was undeniably Nolan's. If you are reading this, my death at the Blackwater Marina was not an accident. The entire world tilted violently on its axis. The official police report I had memorized, the sympathetic, rehearsed nods of the county coroner, the neat little narrative of a tragic, freak electrical failure at the docks. It all shattered into a million jagged, bleeding pieces. I read the sentence again. Then I read it a third time, staring until the black ink blurred into meaningless, floating shapes. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat. It was not a sob. It was the wretched sound of a woman realizing she had been mourning a murdered man, while his killers likely stood right behind her at the funeral, patting her on the shoulder. I forced myself to lower the letter. My eyes drifted back to the corkboard, trying to anchor myself in the physical evidence. I needed to understand the blueprints, decode the money trails, and memorize the faces of the people Nolan had been tracking so relentlessly. But as my gaze scanned the far right side of the board, my heart simply stopped beating. Tucked beneath a complex schematic of a municipal power grid were 5 glossy, high-resolution photographs. I stepped closer, practically pressing my face into the sterile LED light. They were not photos of rigged construction sites or corrupt corporate executives. They were photos of me. One was taken through the rain-streaked window of a coffee shop downtown, showing me staring blankly into a mug. Another showed me walking out of the halcyon building, wrapped tightly in my heavy winter coat. A third was a clear, terrifyingly close shot of my car pulling into the driveway of this very house. I looked at the bright red date stamps printed in the bottom right corners of the images. My stomach violently heaved, and I had to brace my hand against the cold plaster to keep from collapsing to the floor. These pictures were taken 6 weeks after Nolan's funeral. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been following my every move, documenting my grief, and tracking my daily routines long after my husband was put into the cold ground. And then, the true horror of the situation slammed into me, freezing the blood in my veins. Nolan was already dead when these photos were taken. He had been buried for a month and a half. My brilliant, paranoid husband could not have pinned these pictures to this board, which meant only one terrifying thing. Someone else had been inside this hidden room. Someone else knew exactly how to open the wall. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing right now, surrounded by my husband's desperate secrets, and they had left my face on that board as a silent, screaming warning. The flickering light had not been a malfunction. It had been a symptom of an intrusion, and whoever had killed Nolan was not finished with our family. I was raised in the bitter, frost-bitten valleys of northern Vermont. Up there, the winters strip away anything soft or vulnerable, leaving behind only the hard, unyielding truth of basic survival. That frozen landscape fundamentally shaped the architecture of my mind. I learned early on to place my absolute trust in logic, rigid principles, and the cold certainty of mathematics. Numbers do not possess empathy. They do not bend to spare your feelings, and they certainly do not lie to protect you. I built a highly successful career upon that exact ruthlessness. As a forensic accountant, I dissected the financial lives of corrupt men, finding the rot hidden in their ledgers. I viewed the world through a strict lens of suspicion. But then I met Nolan. Nolan Stewart was 42 years old when he was taken from me, and he possessed a profound, radiant warmth that felt entirely out of place in our cynical line of work. Unlike me, Nolan honestly believed that basic human decency still had a permanent seat at the table. Even within the cutthroat, bloodthirsty arenas of municipal contracts and local politics, I met him during a particularly vicious financial audit. I was brought in to tear apart the operational ledgers of a mid-sized coastal contractor who was heavily suspected of gross embezzlement. The boardroom was suffocating, packed with sweating men in expensive tailored suits, all lying through their teeth to protect their bonuses. Nolan was their lead project manager. When I cornered the executive board with a glaring discrepancy of nearly $300,000, Nolan was the only person in that stifling room who looked me directly in the eye and told the absolute truth. He stood up, handed me the missing internal invoices without a single trace of fear, and walked out of the company. I fell in love with that quiet, reckless integrity. He was the one beautiful, honest variable in a world I had always calculated to be corrupt. Shortly after we were married, Nolan accepted a high-level executive position as the Director of Compliance for Ridgecore Civic Systems. At the time, it felt like a massive, celebratory leap forward for our family. Ridgecore was an absolute juggernaut in the construction and infrastructure sector. They made their massive fortunes swooping in after the brutal, devastating hurricane seasons that routinely ravaged the coastal communities. They secured multi-million-dollar government contracts for urban rebuilding, emergency housing, and critical disaster relief infrastructure. Nolan's job was supposed to be straightforward and noble. He was hired to be the moral compass of the corporation. the man personally responsible for ensuring that every concrete beam poured and every electrical wire laid met strict federal safety standards. He was deeply proud of the work. He truly thought he was helping to rebuild broken, desperate cities. But roughly 1 year before his death, the vibrant man I married began to slowly vanish before my eyes. It did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing, daily erosion of his spirit. It started with him taking hushed phone calls out on the back porch in the freezing rain, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper the moment I opened the glass door. Then came the sudden, paranoid changes to his digital life. His computer passwords were swapped out every few days. The security locks on his phone were updated on a weekly basis, and he never left the device unattended. Not even to take a shower. I would frequently wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning to find his side of the mattress empty and cold. When I padded softly down the carpeted hallway, I would find the heavy oak door of his home office firmly locked from the inside. When I finally confronted him over his cold morning coffee, his eyes would dart away, heavily shadowed by deep, bruised bags of chronic exhaustion. He always offered the exact same rehearsed lie, claiming it was simply the crushing pressure of the new municipal rebuilding initiatives and aggressive federal deadlines. Because my entire professional career revolved around dissecting human deceit and uncovering hidden sins, my mind naturally gravitated toward the worst possible conclusions. I spent agonizing, silent months utterly convinced that my husband was having a sordid affair. I secretly searched his shirt collars for unfamiliar perfume. I ruthlessly scrutinized our joint bank statements for unexplained hotel charges or mysterious dinners. When that desperate search turned up absolutely nothing, an even darker suspicion took root in my brain. I began to seriously wonder if Nolan, the most honest man I had ever known, had finally been compromised by the very system he swore to regulate. I terrified myself with the persistent thought that he was deeply entangled in some dirty financial scheme at Ridgecore and simply lacked the courage to confess his massive sins to his fiercely judgmental auditor wife. I spent my days hunting corporate criminals across the country, completely blind to the agonizing fact that my own husband was being actively hunted inside our own home. Then came the horrific night at Blackwater Marina. The official police report firmly classified his death as a rare, catastrophic electrical accident. Nolan had supposedly gone down to the docks alone, late at night, to inspect a secondary power grid that Ridgecore had recently installed near the residential moorings. The local authorities quickly concluded that a primary power pedestal on the wooden pier had suffered a massive electrical leak due to shoddy, deferred maintenance by the marina staff. The coroner stated that Nolan stepped into a puddle of conductive seawater and was killed instantly by a massive surge of current. I remember the day of his funeral in disjointed, suffocating fragments of pure trauma, the bitter coastal wind whipping the black umbrellas, the cloying, sickening smell of white lilies, and Hollis Wynne. Hollis was the chief executive officer of Ridgecore. He was a suave, impeccably tailored, silver-haired man who radiated a quiet, deeply dangerous kind of corporate power. After the heavy wooden casket was finally lowered into the earth, Hollis purposefully approached me. He wrapped his arms around my shaking shoulders in a perfectly calculated, highly visible embrace for the gathered crowd. He squeezed my arm tightly, managed to produce a single, gleaming tear for effect, and spoke in a low voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. Nolan was a profoundly good man. Faith. Hollis had murmured softly into my hair, his breath warm against my ear. But he was simply too stressed. He pushed himself far too hard for the company and for this city. It was a tragic, unavoidable accident. We are all devastated. I swallowed that massive lie without a single protest. I drank it down like a necessary medicine because the alternative reality was simply too massive and terrifying to endure. My grief was a crushing physical weight that threatened to snap my spine, and I desperately needed a simple, tidy, comprehensible container to put it all in. I needed a neat, uncontested label to file away the total destruction of my entire life. So, I categorized my husband's brutal death under bad luck, a freak accident, a cruel, random twist of fate. It was infinitely easier to direct my furious anger at a rusty power pedestal and a negligent, underpaid maintenance crew than to stare into the pitch-black abyss of something intentional and malicious. But standing here right now, bathed in the harsh, sterile white glare of this hidden room, the comforting blanket of that carefully constructed lie was violently ripped away from me. I looked at the chaotic web of red yarn, the terrifying surveillance photos of my own face, and the desperate, frantic notes scribbled by Nolan in the dead of night. Nolan was not stressed by federal deadlines. Nolan was utterly terrified for his life. The locked office doors and the agonizing sleepless nights were not signs of marital infidelity or sudden corporate corruption. They were the desperate, calculated actions of a brilliant man who realized he was trapped in a locked cage with apex predators. The overwhelming evidence surrounding me in this claustrophobic space proved undeniably that Nolan knew he was a marked target for many months before he ever stepped onto that rain-slicked pier. He had been meticulously building a massive case in the shadows, gathering the hard physical proof of whatever monstrous, profitable thing Ridgecore was desperately trying to hide. But the most horrifying realization of all was hidden within the frantic, jagged strokes of his handwriting and the security measures of this very room. Nolan had built this secret vault because he knew the mortal danger was not just out there in the corporate boardrooms or the muddy construction sites. He knew the threat had breached the walls of our daily life. He knew that the person feeding him directly to the wolves, the traitor orchestrating his ultimate downfall, was someone standing close enough to smile in his face. And he died in the dark, trying to figure out how to expose them before they silenced him forever. I dropped to my knees on the cold hardwood floor, my forensic training entirely overriding my shock. I gripped the heavy steel handle of the fireproof safe and dragged it out of the hidden wall cavity. The lock was a standard mechanical dial. I did not need to guess the combination. I entered the exact date of our wedding anniversary, feeling a sickening twist in my gut when the heavy steel bolts retracted with a loud, metallic clack. I swung the heavy door open and began pulling the contents out onto the floor, arranging them in meticulous, rigid rows exactly as I would in a corporate audit room. The secret vault did not contain a single isolated secret. It contained the complete, rotting anatomy of a systemic criminal empire. First came a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs. They were extreme close-ups of industrial electrical components. Next was a massive, encrypted black hard drive, followed by tightly rolled municipal construction blueprints, and several tiny, voice-activated audio recorders. But the most damning items in the safe were physical objects. Nolan had managed to smuggle out two massive, heavy industrial circuit breakers. I picked one up. It weighed nearly 10 pounds. The heavy plastic casing was scratched and dented. But what made the air leave my lungs were the bright yellow inspection seals. They had been crudely sliced open with a razor blade. And a counterfeit, freshly printed serial number sticker had been slapped hastily over the original manufacturer's plate. My eyes darted to the legal pads filled with Nolan's frantic calculations, and the terrifying architecture of Ridgecore's fraud assembled itself perfectly in my mind. Ridgecore Civic Systems was not simply cutting corners on their government contracts. They were engineering a massive, lethal deception. According to the federal bidding documents Nolan had stolen, Ridgecore was charging the government top-tier prices for brand-new, state-of-the-art electrical switchgears, massive breaker panels, and highly sensitive grid infrastructure. But they were never buying new equipment. Instead, they were quietly purchasing thousands of gutted, burnt-out, heavily degraded electrical units from condemned demolition sites and abandoned factories 3 states away. They shipped this dangerous, salvaged garbage into a warehouse, slapped a fresh coat of industrial gray paint over the rust, forged the inspection certificates, and installed them as brand new equipment. By pocketing the massive difference between the cost of industrial trash and the price of pristine infrastructure, Ridgecore was clearing tens of millions of dollars in pure, untraceable profit on every single municipal project. They were building an empire by turning the city into a sprawling network of hidden fire traps. I unrolled the construction blueprints, tracing the thick lines of red ink Nolan had used to mark the installation zones. The realization of where this counterfeit equipment had been installed made my stomach violently heave. Ridgecore had not put these degraded switchgears into empty warehouses or abandoned lots. They had wired them directly into the walls of the most vulnerable populations in Port Sentinel. Nolan's maps showed the fake panels installed deep inside the sprawling temporary housing complexes built specifically for elderly citizens displaced by the last major hurricane. They were wired into the basements of the Central County Archive buildings, the main downtown public transit centers, and several massive subsidized apartment high-rises meant for local civil servants and public school teachers. Thousands of people were sleeping every single night inside buildings, wrapped in electrical veins that could rupture and ignite at any given second. And there had already been warnings. Digging deeper into a manila folder, I found a sickening stack of confidential settlement agreements. There had been a sudden, violent electrical fire in a transit hub break room 6 months ago. A massive power surge had melted life-saving medical equipment in one of the elderly housing units just weeks before Nolan died. There had been frantic, late-night emergency evacuations at a civil servant apartment block due to walls burning hot to the touch. But the public never heard a single word about these near-fatal disasters. Every single incident had been brutally suppressed. Ridgecore's lawyers had swooped in instantly, burying the terrified victims under heavy payouts and ironclad non-disclosure agreements, threatening financial ruin upon anyone who spoke to the local press. None of this massive fraud could have happened without a designated gatekeeper looking the other way. I looked up from the floor, my eyes scanning the chaotic corkboard again until they locked onto a single name circled 3 times in thick black marker: Dean Kessler. He was the chief director of the Municipal Electrical Inspection Bureau. Kessler was the absolute final authority in the city. No public building could legally open its doors without his official signature certifying the safety of the power grid. Nolan had pulled Kessler's personal banking records. The inspector was heavily buried in private gambling debts, and Ridgecore had been quietly feeding him hundreds of thousands of dollars through a dummy consulting firm. Kessler was their golden rubber stamp, happily signing off on counterfeit death traps while collecting his bloody paychecks. My hands were shaking as I reached for another thick folder resting near the back of the plastic bin. The label was written in thick, aggressive red ink. I read the 5 words written across the tab, and the floor seemed to completely drop out from beneath me. Do not trust Avery Cole. A cold, paralyzing shockwave ripped through my chest. Avery Cole was not just a name on a corporate roster. Avery was Nolan's absolute best friend. They had shared a dorm room in college. He was the man who had stood stoically beside me at the muddy graveside. Avery was the brilliant estate lawyer who had sat at my kitchen island for dozens of hours, drinking my coffee, guiding me gently through the agonizing probate process, handling Nolan's massive life insurance policies, and holding my hand while I wept until my throat bled. I opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, proving that Avery had been secretly working as a shadow legal consultant for Ridgecore's executive board. While he was playing the role of the loyal, grieving best friend to me, he had been actively drafting the very non-disclosure agreements used to silence the victims of the electrical fires. The betrayal tasted exactly like battery acid burning the back of my throat. The man who had comforted me in my darkest hours was one of the architects of my destruction. The nightmare kept expanding outward, infecting every pillar of the city. I picked up a yellow legal pad that detailed exactly why the local police department had been so eager and incredibly fast to declare Nolan's electrocution a tragic, unavoidable accident. The Port Sentinel Police Department relied heavily on discretionary municipal funding to maintain their lucrative pension plans and secure their annual budget expansions. That entire pipeline of city money was tightly controlled by the political fundraising network of Adrienne Pike, Councilwoman Pike was the glowing, relentlessly compassionate face of the city's hurricane recovery efforts. She was on every local television station, handing out bottled water and promising swift rebuilding. But Nolan's meticulous financial tracking proved her primary political action committee was nothing more than a sophisticated money laundering machine. Ridgecorp funneled millions into her campaign funds. And in exchange, Pike ensured the local police chief kept his officers completely blind, docile, and far away from Ridgecorp construction sites. When Nolan died, a single phone call from Pike's office had shut the entire police investigation down within 48 hours. I sat back on my heels, entirely surrounded by the damning paperwork. Nolan had mapped the entire beast. He had the motive, the method, and the money trail. He just needed a weapon to kill it. I found that weapon buried at the very bottom of the safe. It was a cheap, prepaid, disposable cell phone. I held the small plastic device in my palm and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, showing a battery icon clinging to a single, desperate red sliver of power. I opened the text message application. There was only one item sitting in the drafts folder. It was an unsent message addressed to a woman named Laurel Price. I instantly recognized the name from my years in forensic accounting. Laurel Price was a notoriously ruthless, highly feared federal investigator working for the Interstate Public Integrity Unit. Her entire career was dedicated to prosecuting the massive theft of federal disaster relief grants. I opened the draft. It contained a random, complex sequence of numbers, which I immediately recognized as a secure digital identification code, followed by a terrifyingly brief instruction. My name is Nolan Stewart. If I go dark, use this code to unlock the master ledger. They are building fire traps. They know I am looking. He had been preparing to hand the entire conspiracy over to the federal government. He had built the bomb, but they had murdered him before he could press the detonator. My eyes drifted away from the phone and landed on a small, rugged, waterproof plastic case sitting in the corner of the safe. It was a heavy-duty container specifically designed to protect highly sensitive digital media. I reached over, my fingers numb, and popped the heavy plastic latches. Inside, the dense black shockproof foam was precision-cut into tiny, uniform rectangles. Several of the slots were filled with standard digital memory cards. But right in the exact center of the protective foam, one single slot was completely empty. I leaned in closer, bringing the case directly under the harsh white glare of the battery-powered LED light. Taped directly beneath the empty void was a tiny, jagged piece of white medical tape. Written across the tape, in Nolan's unmistakable handwriting, were two words: Doc Night. A terrible, suffocating silence filled the hidden room. I stared at the empty slot until my vision blurred. The USB drive containing the direct evidence of his final night alive. The ultimate proof of what truly happened at the Blackwater Marina had been stored right here, and someone had already taken it. I sat on the cold hardwood floor of the office, breathing in the stale air rushing out of the hidden cavity. A normal, grieving widow would have frantically gathered these horrifying papers, run straight to the nearest police precinct, and demanded immediate justice. But I was not a normal woman. I was a forensic auditor. I understood the exact, brutal mathematics of power. I knew precisely what happened to raw, unorganized evidence when it was handed over to a corrupted, heavily funded system. It simply vanishes. It gets misfiled in a dark basement, accidentally destroyed in a convenient administrative fire, or legally suffocated under a massive mountain of expensive defense motions. If I made one single misstep, if I showed my hand before I held all the winning cards, my husband would permanently remain a clumsy man who slipped on a wet dock, and I would be quickly painted as a hysterical, paranoid woman who had tragically lost her mind. I needed a strategy. Before Caleb packed up his tools to leave, his face still devoid of all color, He pointed a trembling finger at the hollow space behind where the old brass light fixture used to sit. Ms. Stewart, he whispered, pulling a tiny pair of metal tweezers from his heavy leather belt. He reached into the tangled mess of wires and carefully extracted a small, circular metallic disc. It was barely the size of a dime. It was a high-frequency acoustic transmitter, a professional-grade listening device. The blood rushed violently out of my head, leaving me dizzy and sick. This room had not just been a secret vault where my husband hid his desperate work. It had been a live microphone. Someone had been sitting in the dark, listening to him breathing, listening to his pen scratching across the legal pads, listening to the exact moment he realized he was going to die. I could not stay in that house. I locked the front door, drove back into the city, and did not sleep for a single second. Under the cover of darkness, I logged directly into the highly secured, encrypted mainframe of Halcyon Forensic Advisory from my dining room table. I possessed top-tier executive clearance, allowing me to bypass the standard security firewalls. I immediately began pulling the massive municipal bond issuance records for every single public project Ridgecore had touched over the last 4 years. I cross-referenced their approved vendor lists against the forged electrical components Nolan had discovered. It took me less than 6 hours to completely map the rot. By sunrise, I had successfully identified over a dozen different corporate shell companies. Every single one of them shared the exact same registered agent and a dusty post office box address located in Wyoming. The money did not stop there. The massive, fraudulent funds were systematically washed through a highly complex labyrinth of intermediary corporate accounts registered in Montana and Delaware, effectively stripping away the original source data and making the cash look entirely legitimate. But dirty money always leaves a shadow if you possess the right lens to see it. The final, sanitized payouts trickled perfectly into 2 distinct, heavily guarded financial reservoirs. One was a private wealth management trust legally controlled by the younger sister of Hollis Wynne. The other was the primary political action committee currently funding Adrian Pike. Then, I found the ticking clock. Ridgecore was not just resting comfortably on their past crimes. They were actively preparing to swallow another massive, unprecedented influx of public money. I discovered that one of the massive subsidized housing towers, currently wired floor to ceiling with their explosive, counterfeit equipment, was scheduled to be completely refinanced under a brand new urban development bond package. The official city council vote was happening in exactly 14 days. If that massive financial deal went through, millions of fresh tax dollars would wash over the corrupted project, creating a brand new layer of legitimate financial scaffolding that would permanently bury the fake invoices beneath ironclad federal protections. Ridgecore would secure another massive payday, and the evidence of their deadly fraud would be locked away forever. I had to break the company before that gavel fell. I knew I could not keep the authentic, dangerous files inside the house. I spent the early hours of the morning ruthlessly dividing the physical evidence into 3 separate, waterproof lockboxes. I secured one inside a private storage unit rented under a fabricated name, mailed the second to a defunct postal box I still controlled, and hid the third deep inside the spare tire compartment of my car. Then, I sat down and meticulously crafted a masterpiece of absolute fiction. I built a dummy file. I used authentic corporate letterheads I had stolen from the office, but I subtly altered the dates, shifted the dollar amounts by a few decimal points, and completely changed the names of the shell companies. It was a highly calculated trap designed to look exactly like the real thing to a panicked, guilty mind. The next afternoon, I intentionally invited Avery Cole to my house for a quiet cup of coffee. He sat comfortably at my kitchen island, wearing his expensive tailored suit and a flawless, deeply practiced mask of brotherly concern. I poured him a cup of dark roast, deliberately letting my hands tremble just enough against the porcelain to sell the performance of a broken, grieving widow. "Avery," I said, my voice thick with manufactured exhaustion and forced tears, I desperately need your advice. I was finally going through some of his old things yesterday, and I found a hidden panel behind the wall in his office. Avery completely froze. The absolute stillness of his body in that moment was louder than a gunshot. He carefully set his coffee mug down on the granite counter, his knuckles turning slightly white. I did not give his brilliant, calculating legal mind the time to formulate a response. I pushed the narrative exactly where I needed it to go. There was nothing in there but some old, useless tax returns and an empty box. I lied smoothly, staring directly into his eyes. But it really got me thinking. He was so incredibly paranoid at the very end. I honestly think the most important files, whatever dangerous thing he was working on, are hidden deep inside his old encrypted laptop. I found it in his closet. I am going to take it to a private data recovery specialist tomorrow morning. I watched Avery's dark eyes frantically track this new, terrifying information. He swallowed hard, quickly recovered his composure, and nodded slowly. He immediately offered to take the heavy laptop for me, insisting he wanted to save me the terrible emotional burden of dealing with the electronics. I politely, firmly declined his generous offer. That night, I packed a small overnight bag and quietly checked into a cheap, anonymous roadside motel 3 towns over. I left the fabricated dummy file sitting clearly on the edge of the mahogany desk in Nolan's office, placed directly next to an old, thoroughly broken laptop I had purchased at a local pawn shop years ago. I did not have to wait very long for the trap to spring. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the silent security alert on my mobile phone illuminated the dark motel room. I sat up in bed and opened the live, encrypted camera feed I had secretly installed inside the hallway bookshelf earlier that afternoon. A tall figure dressed entirely in black tactical clothing moved smoothly and silently through my dark house. They did not touch the expensive diamond jewelry sitting in plain sight on my bedroom dresser. They did not even glance at the emergency envelope of cash kept in the open kitchen drawer. They walked directly into the office. The intruder violently ransacked the desk drawers, grabbed the broken pawn shop laptop, snatched the dummy file, and vanished back into the night without leaving a single fingerprint behind. It was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation. The ruthless hunters who had murdered my husband were still actively circling my life, terrified of what he had left behind. But they had just swallowed a massive dose of poison. I was no longer the blind, passive prey wandering through the woods. I could see the entire chessboard, and I was finally ready to play. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent house. I opened it to find Avery standing on my porch. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and an expression of profound, agonizing concern that could have won a theatrical award. He had rushed over the absolute second I called him to report the break-in. "Are you hurt?" Avery demanded, grasping both of my shoulders with his warm hands. "The police told me the intruder only hit the office. Tell me you are all right." I let out a shaky, manufactured breath and leaned into his touch, playing the role of the fragile, terrified widow he desperately needed me to be. I led him down the hallway and into the crime scene. The room was a calculated disaster of overturned chairs and scattered papers. Avery stepped carefully over the debris, his eyes scanning the chaos. But I was not looking at the floor. I was watching his eyes. His gaze swept right past the empty space where the pawn shop laptop used to sit. Instead, his focus snagged on the far wall. I had hired a discreet contractor to temporarily patch the drywall before the sun came up, sealing the hidden cavity behind a fresh layer of white plaster. Avery stared at that specific patch of wall for 3 seconds too long. It was a microscopic lapse in his ironclad composure, but to a forensic auditor, it was a glaring red flag. "They took the computer," I whispered, wrapping my arms around my own torso. "Just like I told you they would. He was working on something dangerous. Avery. I know it." Avery turned back to me, his face softening into a mask of pity. "We talked about this," he said gently, taking a step closer. He was not sleeping. He was drowning in his own mind. Towards the end, he was rambling about ridiculous conspiracies. He actually sat in my car and told me Ridgecore was building fire traps out of the municipal housing projects. The air in the room suddenly turned into solid ice. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently, I thought it might crack the bone. But I kept my facial muscles entirely paralyzed. Building fire traps. That exact, highly specific phrasing was written in red ink on the legal pad locked inside my hidden lockbox. I had never spoken those words to Avery. I had never shown him the files. There was absolutely no way on earth he could know that phrase unless he had either stood inside that hidden room, or he had listened to Nolan say it through the acoustic bug planted behind the wall. Fire traps, I echoed, forcing my voice to tremble. What does that even mean? It means nothing, Avery soothed, stepping forward to wrap me in a tight, suffocating hug. It means he was sick, and whoever broke in last night was probably just a random junkie looking for expensive electronics. Let the police handle this. You need to rest. I buried my face in his expensive woolen shoulder and nodded, promising him I would step back. I let the man who had orchestrated my husband's destruction hold me in his arms, using every ounce of my willpower to keep my hands from wrapping around his throat. At noon, after Avery had finally left to attend a court hearing, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. I carried it to the kitchen island and tore it open. 2 items fell onto the granite counter. The first was an old, deactivated corporate access card bearing the Ridgecore Company logo. The second was a single sheet of unlined notebook paper containing a handwritten message. I was a coward when your husband was alive. I do not want to be a coward anymore. I recognized the looping, left-handed script immediately. It belonged to Tessa Vance. She was the former comptroller for Ridgecore. 3 weeks after the funeral, she had quietly resigned her highly lucrative position, packed up her entire house, and completely vanished from the city without telling a single colleague where she was going. I used my secure access at the firm to run a rapid trace on the postal routing code stamped on the envelope. It led me to a small, run-down coastal town 2 hours north of the city limits. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in a dim, empty diner overlooking a gray stretch of ocean, sliding into a vinyl booth across from a woman who looked like she had aged 10 years in a matter of months. Tessa was trembling, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of black coffee. She did not bother with pleasantries. She looked directly at me with bloodshot eyes and began to systematically dismantle the remaining mysteries of my husband's life. You thought he was cheating on you, Tessa said, her voice a hollow rasp. The woman you saw him talking to downtown, the one he was constantly texting late at night. She was not his mistress. She was an independent investigative journalist. He was using her to quietly verify the structural blueprints before he went to the authorities. A massive, suffocating weight that I had carried for over a year suddenly evaporated from my chest, immediately replaced by a fresh, burning wave of absolute rage. He had been faithful to me until his very last breath. The night he died. Tessa continued, her eyes dropping to the table. Was supposed to be the handoff. He packed the materials he intended to pass on and went to the marina to meet her, but she never showed up. Someone intercepted his communications. I know about the counterfeit equipment, I told her quietly. I know about the fake invoices, but why did Avery do it? They were brothers. Tessa let out a bitter, ugly laugh. Because loyalty does not pay dividends. 2 weeks before Nolan was killed, Avery used his legal authority over your estate planning to quietly restructure a temporary trust holding Nolan's stock options. When Nolan died, the police ruled it an accident, which meant the company stock did not crash. If Nolan had gone public with his evidence, Ridgecore would have gone bankrupt overnight, and those shares would have been worthless. By ensuring your husband died a quiet, accidental death, Avery secured hundreds of thousands of dollars in stable equity payouts for himself. My stomach violently recoiled. Avery had weighed the value of his best friend's life against a stock portfolio, and the money had won. "There is one more thing," Tessa whispered, reaching into her worn leather purse. She pulled out a heavily folded manila envelope and slid it across the table. "I paid a clerk at the county medical office to pull this before I fled the city. It is the raw, unedited intake report from the forensic pathologist, the one they drafted before Adrienne Pike made her phone calls to sanitize the official record." I opened the file. Inside were the glaring, unvarnished clinical details of my husband's corpse. I skipped past the descriptions of the electrical burns and locked onto a secondary notation buried on the third page. The original coroner had documented a severe, circular contusion wrapping completely around Nolan's right wrist. It was a clear, undeniable ligature mark, characteristic of someone being violently restrained by a heavy nylon strap or a strong hand. That detail had been entirely deleted from the final public autopsy report. Nolan did not slip and fall onto a live wire. He had been hunted down in the dark, physically overpowered, held down against the wet wooden planks of the pier, and deliberately electrocuted. I sat in the dim diner for a long time, staring at the black and white photograph of my husband's bruised wrist. The grief that had paralyzed me for 18 months finally burned away completely, leaving behind a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I closed the file and stood up from the booth. I was no longer a mourning widow looking for closure. I was a weapon. I was not going to simply hand this evidence over to a prosecutor and hope the justice system worked. The system was exactly what killed him. I was going to tear down their entire corporate empire brick by brick. I was going to financially gut them, legally suffocate them, and then I was going to force every single one of them to stand in the bright light of day and rip off their own masks. Avery, Hollis, Dean, and the rest of their parasites were going to feel the exact same terror my husband felt on that pier. The math was finally adding up, and I was going to collect every single debt. I did not shed another tear. The woman who wept over empty suits in a closet was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating architect of ruin. My first move was to power on the cheap burner phone Nolan had left in the bottom of the fireproof safe. I opened the unsent draft, memorized the long numerical sequence, and initiated a secure, encrypted connection to Laurel Price at the Interstate Public Integrity Unit. We met the next morning in a sterile, windowless conference room inside a federal building downtown. Laurel was a sharp, uncompromising woman who did not waste a single second on pleasantries. She confirmed my worst fears immediately. Nolan had indeed reached out to her department months ago. He had sent desperate distress signals, utilizing his specific identification code to warn her about the catastrophic infrastructure fraud. But before he could physically deliver the master ledger to validate his claims, he was killed. Without the physical evidence, the federal prosecutors refused to move forward, and his desperate plea was permanently suspended as an unverified suspicion. "It is not a suspicion anymore," I told Laurel quietly, sliding a thick manila envelope across the steel table. I had spent the entire night processing the internal reconciliation spreadsheets Tessa Vance had handed me at the diner. I walked Laurel through the irrefutable, cold mathematics of the crime. The official serial numbers printed on the forged municipal acceptance logs did not match the physical hardware installed within the city. I explained exactly how I had tracked the counterfeit logistics network. Ridgecore had aggressively purchased thousands of tons of gutted, obsolete switchgears from an abandoned, bankrupt casino out in Nevada. They utilized a complex labyrinth of 3 separate shell companies to launder the hardware, eventually shipping it back into Port Sentinel packaged with counterfeit labels declaring the rusted garbage was 100% new relief equipment. Laurel stared at the spreadsheets, her eyes hardening as the sheer scale of the felony crystallized in her mind. She immediately began constructing the federal criminal indictments. But I knew that putting wealthy executives in prison could take years of agonizing legal warfare. I wanted to bleed them immediately. While Laurel built the criminal case, I engineered a devastating financial strike, using my corporate expertise. I drafted a massive, undeniable dossier proving bond issuance fraud, the deliberate falsification of risk assessment reports, and the intentional concealment of systemic, lethal hazards. My target was not a courtroom. My target was the institutional investors. Once I leaked this document to their underwriters, Ridgecore would suffer an instantaneous, permanent credit freeze. They would not be able to borrow a single dollar to keep their rotting empire afloat. With the financial guillotine quietly hoisted into place, I turned my attention back to the traitor standing inside my own family. Avery Cole believed he was outsmarting a grieving, incompetent widow. I weaponized his arrogance against him. I invited him to a late lunch at a crowded, upscale bistro downtown. I maintained my fragile facade perfectly, keeping my voice small and my hands trembling as I held my water glass. I leaned across the white tablecloth and whispered a carefully constructed lie. "Avery, I remembered something last night," I murmured, staring into his dark eyes. Nolan secretly rented a climate-controlled storage unit on the outskirts of the industrial district right before he died. I am absolutely certain the real laptop, the one with all his dangerous research, is locked inside. I handed Avery the unit number written on a napkin, begging him to handle the legal paperwork required to access the facility. Avery squeezed my hand, putting on a sickening display of sympathy, and promised he would take care of everything to protect me. He took the bait in less than 24 hours. The following night, I sat parked in an unmarked sedan alongside Laurel, staring at a luminous tablet screen. The live feed from the concealed camera I had installed inside the storage unit painted the dark interior in stark green night vision. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy metal door was forced open. A man stepped inside, sweeping the empty room with a flashlight. Laurel immediately ran his facial profile through the federal database. He was a high-level operative working for an outsourced private security firm. The firm's primary, off-the-books benefactor was Dean Kessler. Avery had not gone to the police or the estate judges. He had marched straight to the people who executed my husband and handed them the target. I could not wage this war from a compromised fortress. I summoned Caleb Mercer back to my house. The electrician was pale and visibly shaking when he stepped through my front door. But his moral compass outweighed his terror. I handed him a thick envelope of cash for his absolute silence and instructed him to physically tear my house apart. He spent 9 grueling hours dismantling every single light fixture, prying open air vents, and scanning the drywall with specialized frequency equipment. We found 3 more microscopic listening devices buried deep in the architecture. Caleb was no longer just a hired contractor who stumbled into a secret. He was a vital, protected federal witness to corporate espionage. Everything was falling perfectly into place, but the most agonizing piece of the puzzle remained missing. The events of the night Nolan died at the marina were still trapped in the shadows. That changed when Laurel brought a ghost into our secure safe house. Her name was Mina Doyle. She was the independent investigative journalist Nolan had been secretly working with. The local newspapers had reported that Mina abandoned her entire career and fled the state after a highly suspicious electrical fire gutted her apartment 6 months ago. The truth was, Mina had faked her complete breakdown and vanished into the underground to stay alive. Mina sat across from me, looking exhausted but fiercely resilient. She slid a thick-bound portfolio of printed, encrypted email communications onto the table, verifying every single detail Nolan had shared with her. But it was her final revelation that stopped the breath in my throat and turned the blood in my veins to ice. I asked her about the missing physical drive. I asked her who could have stolen the drive labeled Doc Knight from the hidden safe after Nolan was killed. Mina looked at me with deep, profound sorrow in her eyes. She explained that the drive was never stolen from the crime scene. Nolan had never brought it to the marina that night. In a fatal, tragic moment of misplaced trust, Nolan had handed the primary, unencrypted copy of his evidence over to the only person he believed would protect his family if he was murdered. Avery Cole already possessed the Dock Night drive days before the electrocution. Avery had taken the ultimate weapon, looked his oldest friend in the eye, and never had any intention of giving it back to me. He had been holding the knife behind his back the entire time. The counterattack did not come with a warning. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours after I had initiated the financial strike against Ridgecore. I walked into the lobby of Halcyon Forensic Advisory, completely prepared to pull the final, damning tranches of bond data from the secure servers. Instead, my security badge flashed a harsh red light at the turnstile. The heavy glass gates refused to open. Within 5 minutes, I was sitting across from the head of Human Resources and the senior compliance officer. They slid a thick, sealed envelope across the polished mahogany table. It was an anonymous, highly detailed ethics complaint. The document accused me of gross professional misconduct, fabricating audit evidence, and utilizing firm resources to conduct an illegal, unauthorized vendetta. Effective immediately, I was placed on an indefinite, unpaid suspension. My corporate credentials were revoked. My physical office was locked, and my digital access to the mainframe was completely severed at the exact moment I needed it the most. But the true, suffocating horror of that meeting was not the suspension itself. It was the signature scrawled at the very bottom of the executive approval form. Grant Lyle. Grant was the senior managing partner at Halcyon. For over 15 years, he had been my absolute compass in the forensic accounting world. He was the man who recruited me out of graduate school, trained me to hunt hidden assets, and stood at the altar as a groomsman at my wedding. I had revered him as a second father, looking at his signature on the document that effectively destroyed my career. The walls of the room seemed to violently compress inward. The suffocating pressure did not stop at my professional life. By noon, the local news stations were running breaking, exclusive reports about the tragic death at Blackwater Marina. The powerful men I was hunting were pulling their media levers, and they were using them to systematically assassinate my dead husband's character. I sat in my living room, watching the television screen blur as perfectly coiffed anchors cited anonymous sources close to the investigation. They claimed Nolan had been suffering from severe mental instability in his final months. They heavily implied he was under internal investigation for corporate embezzlement. The evening broadcasts painted a pathetic picture of a deeply disturbed, paranoid man who died because he was conducting unauthorized, erratic inspections late at night to cover his own financial tracks. Within a few short hours, the public image of the most honorable man I had ever known was brutally twisted into a cautionary tale of a corrupt, unstable executive. It was the exact, merciless tactic the powerful always used. They weaponized the silence of the dead. My phone vibrated against the coffee table. It was Laurel Price. She demanded I meet her at the federal safe house immediately. When I arrived, Laurel was pacing the floor, holding a printed copy of the notes Nolan had left inside the hidden wall cavity. She pointed to a section I had previously overlooked in my frantic search for physical hardware evidence. "He knew," Laurel said, her voice tight with tension. "Your husband knew they were always one step ahead of him. He wrote down a theory. Faith. He believed there was a mole deeply embedded inside your firm." The pieces violently locked together in my mind. For years, Halcyon had been the premier auditing firm contracted by the city to oversee municipal spending. Whenever I was assigned to investigate a contractor, I always reported my schedule, my targeted accounts, and my preliminary findings directly to my senior partner. Grant Lyle had been holding the master key to my entire investigative rhythm. He was the one feeding my audit schedules and internal strategies directly to Ridgecore, ensuring their financial ledgers were perfectly sanitized long before I ever walked through their doors. I did not scream. I did not storm into his house and demand an explanation. I chose a far more terrifying approach. I intercepted Grant the following morning at his private country club. He was sitting alone on the outdoor terrace, drinking an espresso. He looked up, his face momentarily freezing before he forced a strained, deeply uncomfortable smile. "Faith," Grant stammered, standing up from his chair. "You should not be here. Legal advised me not to have any contact with you until the internal investigation concludes." "I just came to thank you, Grant," I said softly, taking the seat directly across from him. I kept my voice entirely even, devoid of any anger or accusation. I just stared pleasantly into his eyes. "I know you were just following protocol with the suspension, but it actually gave me the free time I needed to look through some old municipal bond allocations. Specifically, the ones Ridgecore routed through the Delaware trusts." Grant swallowed hard. The color began to rapidly drain from his cheeks. "It is fascinating," I continued, leaning forward slightly, letting the silence stretch between my words. "I found a very strange anomaly. Someone inside Halcyon was approving those specific risk assessment reports without running the mandatory secondary audits. I am going to turn the raw data over to the federal authorities this afternoon. I just thought you would want a heads up, considering your name is on the oversight committee." I watched the absolute panic bloom behind his eyes. He tried to take a sip of his espresso, but his hand was shaking so badly the porcelain cup rattled aggressively against the saucer. I did not need a confession. His sheer naked terror was all the validation I required. I smiled politely, stood up, and walked away, leaving him to suffocate in the knowledge that the noose was tightening around his own throat. The momentum finally shifted back to our side later that evening. Laurel called me with the first major tactical victory. Federal marshals had successfully intercepted Ross Tyndall, the general manager of the Blackwater Marina. He was caught at the regional airport, attempting to board a one-way flight out of the state with a duffel bag stuffed with $80,000 in untraceable cash. Under the immense threat of federal conspiracy charges, Tyndall completely shattered in the interrogation room. Laurel let me listen to the audio feed. Tyndall sobbed uncontrollably as he confessed everything. He admitted that less than 1 hour after Nolan was electrocuted, Avery Cole had arrived at the marina. Avery paid Tyndall the massive sum of cash in exchange for 2 things. Tyndall physically removed the original hard drives from the security camera servers overlooking the docks, and he completely fabricated the digital maintenance logs to make it look like the electrical pedestal had been malfunctioning for weeks. Avery had bought the official narrative with cold, hard cash while my husband's body was still lying on the wet wood. I returned to my dark, empty house and sat alone in Nolan's office. I pulled out one of the tiny audio recorders we had recovered from the safe. I had avoided listening to it, terrified of hearing his voice again, but I needed to hear him. I pressed play. The tape hissed with static, and then Nolan's exhausted, heavy voice filled the silent room. "I found the transmitter," Nolan whispered on the recording. "They planted a bug behind the plaster. It is hardwired directly into the electrical line running to the ceiling light. It draws its power straight from the fixture. That is why the bulb keeps flickering. The frequency disrupts the current." I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs as his voice continued. "I cannot remove it without alerting them," he said. "If the light stops flickering, if it goes completely dead, it means one of 2 things. Either the power source has been permanently severed, or the watcher has come back to tear the wall open." The recording clicked off, leaving me in total silence. My eyes slowly drifted up to the ceiling, staring at the empty, jagged hole where Caleb had completely detached the heavy brass fixture. A violent jolt of pure adrenaline shot straight down my spine as the final, horrifying realization crashed over me. Caleb had not just accidentally stumbled upon a hidden door. When he arrived at my house at 2 o'clock that afternoon, he had immediately thrown the main circuit breaker in the basement to safely remove the damaged light. By cutting the power, he instantly killed the feed to the listening device. The people hunting me were actively monitoring that audio feed the moment the transmission went dead. They would have assumed someone was inside the wall. Caleb's frantic, whispered phone call to me was not just the inciting incident of my discovery. It was a physical blockade. If I had let the phone ring through to voicemail, if I had stayed in my corporate meeting for another hour, the people who murdered my husband would have arrived at my house. They were already on their way. Caleb's presence, and my immediate rush home, had physically intercepted the enemy before they could pry the wall open and steal the final pieces of the evidence. I was not just hunting them. We were circling each other in the dark, and we were running out of time. I needed Avery to believe he had won. Men like him. Men built entirely out of arrogance, expensive degrees, and stolen power, share one fatal, highly predictable weakness. They fundamentally underestimate the women they break. I sat at my dining room table, staring at the blank wall, and meticulously rehearsed the exact pitch and cadence of my voice. I could not sound like a seasoned forensic accountant preparing for an audit. I had to sound exactly like a shattered, exhausted widow who had finally hit her absolute, irreversible breaking point. I picked up my mobile phone and called him. When he answered, I let my voice crack perfectly on the second syllable of his name. Avery, I cannot do this anymore. I wept into the receiver, squeezing my eyes shut to force a physical, ragged tremor deep into my chest. I am completely done. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I just want to finalize the estate, sell the damn house, and move away from the coast. I do not care about the hidden files or the paranoia anymore. I just want my cut of the life insurance so I can disappear and forget this ever happened. I could practically hear the arrogant, triumphant smirk in his voice. He immediately softened his tone, pouring on that sickening, rehearsed brotherly warmth he had used at the funeral. He fully believed I had finally surrendered to the crushing weight of grief and the mounting financial pressure. He readily agreed to meet me the following evening to sign the final disbursement papers, offering to bring the documents to me so I would not have to face the public. I chose a neutral, high-end short-term rental apartment on the east side of the city. I told him my own house felt far too suffocating and haunted to sit in. In reality, Laurel Price and her federal technical team had spent 6 grueling hours wiring the entire apartment with microscopic, military-grade audio and visual recorders. The lenses were hidden behind the television bezel and the air conditioning vents. When Avery walked through the heavy wooden door that evening, carrying his expensive leather briefcase, he believed we were in an entirely secure, unmonitored environment. He thought he was walking into a surrender ceremony. He confidently poured himself a heavy glass of expensive bourbon from the crystal decanter resting on the kitchen island, looking around the pristine, sterile living room with absolute, relaxed confidence. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat back. You are making the right choice. Faith, Avery said smoothly, taking a seat across from me on the white leather sofa. Nolan was drowning. His mind was entirely gone. If you start digging into his paranoid delusions, the corporate lawyers will aggressively freeze your assets for years. You will lose everything in civil court. Take the money. Start your life over. I looked down at my hands, twisting my cold wedding band around my finger. I forced a single tear to spill over my lower lash line. I just do not understand why they had to be so incredibly cruel, I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor to play the role of the defeated prey. He was going to ruin them. Avery, I know that now. But why did Hollis have to take it that far? Why did he have to hurt him? Avery took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, the heavy alcohol, combined with his overwhelming sense of absolute victory over me, loosened the final, critical knot of his legal caution. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at me with cold, patronizing pity. He wanted to comfort me by minimizing the murder. Hollis never intended for it to go that far, Avery said, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur that echoed perfectly into the federal microphones. He just wanted to teach Nolan a hard lesson, to scare him into dropping the internal audit. It was supposed to be a severe warning to back off the municipal contracts. I held my breath, letting the heavy silence draw the rest of the poison directly out of his mouth. "Then why is my husband dead?" I asked, my voice barely a fragile, broken breath. Avery sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with an expression of mild annoyance, as if my husband's death was merely a clerical error. "Because Dean Kessler is a clumsy, incompetent idiot." Dean was supposed to arrange a simple localized short circuit on the dock, a bright spark to frighten him, to show him that accidents can happen anywhere if you push the wrong people. But Dean wired the pedestal bypass incorrectly. It pulled a massive, lethal current. He never explicitly used the word kill. His brilliant, cowardly legal mind instinctively avoided the absolute, prosecutable phrasing of murder. But it absolutely did not matter. The trap snapped shut with a resounding, deafening finality. He had just handed me the live, bleeding link I desperately needed. Avery had officially tied Hollis Wynn's direct executive orders to Dean Kessler's physical tampering at the crime scene. He had admitted to the full scheme on government recordings, effectively handing the authorities the key to his own cell. While Avery was walking out of that apartment, completely convinced he had permanently neutralized me, I was already sitting at my encrypted laptop, initiating the terminal phase of the financial strike. The explosive evidence of Ridgecorp's lethal fraud could no longer sit in a quiet federal holding pattern. I bypassed the agonizingly slow crawl of the criminal justice system and aimed directly for the corporate jugular. I compiled the devastating, irrefutable dossiers and sent them via heavily encrypted channels to the two most critical arteries of Ridgecorp's survival. The first package went directly to the Executive Compliance Board of their primary surety bond insurer. The second went to the lead risk assessment officers of the massive international banking syndicate currently underwriting Ridgecorp's new refinancing package. Inside those massive digital files was the ultimate detonator, personally delivered by Tessa Vance. She had retained the original, unedited acceptance photographs from the municipal housing projects. These high-resolution images clearly showed the authentic, heavily degraded serial numbers stamped on the rusted electrical equipment long before Ridgecorp slapped their shiny counterfeit labels over them. It was physical proof of systemic fraud that could not be legally manipulated. The moment those bankers and insurance adjusters opened that file, the entire corporate structure of Ridgecorp Civic Systems transformed from a lucrative investment into a radioactive, catastrophic liability. Their credit lines would freeze instantly, with the corporation silently bleeding out in cyberspace. I turned the knife on the traitor who had orchestrated my professional suspension. Grant Lyle thought his senior position at Halcyon made him entirely untouchable, but Laurel Price and I had spent the weekend ruthlessly dissecting his offshore banking records. We tracked a massive, continuous stream of highly lucrative consulting fees flowing directly from Adrian Pike's Political Action Committee, completely washing through a fabricated media company and dumping straight into Grant's private wealth management account. He was taking direct political bribes to intentionally blindfold the city's premier auditing firm. Laurel bypassed the corrupt local authorities entirely and handed the unredacted bank statements directly to the Federal Election Commission. Grant was not just facing professional ruin and the loss of his prestigious career. He was staring down a decade in a federal penitentiary for racketeering and campaign finance fraud. His leverage over my life was instantly vaporized. An emergency meeting of the Ridgecorp Board of Directors was scheduled for 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The sole purpose of the gathering was to officially authorize the final executive signatures on their massive new capital package. It was meant to be their absolute triumph, the final injection of hundreds of millions of dollars that would permanently cement their political power and bury my husband's legacy forever beneath a mountain of fresh concrete. Hollis Wynn spent his entire weekend confidently preparing his victory speech, completely blind to the agonizing reality of his situation. He had no idea that his closest legal fixer had confessed to the conspiracy on tape. He did not know his primary electrical inspector was utterly compromised. He had absolutely no clue that his banking underwriters were currently reading the very files he had murdered my husband to conceal. He was going to walk into that pristine boardroom on Monday morning believing he was the untouchable, unchallenged king of the city. He had absolutely no idea that the entire ceiling was already violently fracturing, and I was standing right above him, waiting patiently for the exact moment to let it all crash down. Mina Doyle sat across from me in the dim, sterile light of the federal safe house, sliding a slim digital audio player across the cold metal table. Laurel Price stood silently by the reinforced door. A covert federal warrant had allowed them to rip through the heavily encrypted architecture of Avery Cole's personal cloud storage. Mina had spent 48 unbroken hours dismantling his digital firewalls. What she extracted was the absolute darkest piece of the puzzle. It was the missing data from the Doc Night drive. It was the ambient backup recording Nolan had proactively initiated on his hidden device, anticipating a tense but successful handover of evidence. He never knew he was recording his own execution. My hand hovered over the playback button. I braced myself against the physical edge of the table, took a shallow breath, and pressed play. The small room instantly filled with the hollow, echoing sound of cold seawater violently slapping against the wooden pilings of the Blackwater Marina. The bitter wind whipped through the microphone. Then, my husband spoke. His voice was so incredibly clear, so vibrant and undeniably alive, that a jagged shard of pure, unadulterated agony lodged directly in my throat. "Avery, are you absolutely sure Laurel Price is meeting us all the way out here?" Nolan asked. His tone was thick with heavy exhaustion and biting cold. But beneath the fear, there was a profound, heartbreaking layer of absolute trust. He genuinely believed the man standing next to him was his shield. He believed his oldest friend was escorting him into federal protection. "She is on her way. Nolan, just relax. Give it another 10 minutes, Avery replied. His voice was entirely smooth, sickeningly calm, and completely devoid of panic. The cadence of his words was perfectly calculated. He was intentionally keeping Nolan pinned to that exact spot on the wooden pier. Footsteps echoed on the recording. Heavy, deliberate boots stepping onto the wooden planks from the gravel parking lot. "Who is that?" Nolan asked, his voice suddenly spiking with sharp instinctual alarm. "Avery, who is walking down the dock." "Just stay calm," Avery commanded, his tone dropping its brotherly warmth, turning flat and authoritative. The heavy footsteps stopped. The metallic, grinding sound of a heavy industrial breaker box being wrenched open echoed through the audio feed. It was Dean Kessler. The municipal inspector had arrived to arm the trap. Then came the sound that made the blood in my veins completely freeze. It was the distinct, electronic chime of a cellular phone being placed on speaker mode. "Is the problem contained, Avery?" The voice projecting through the speakerphone was cold, aristocratic, and dripping with absolute authority. It was Hollis Wynn. The chief executive officer of Ridgecorp was not even present in the cold night air. He was directing the murder of my husband from the comfort of a heated room, listening to the feed like a theatrical director calling the final cue of a play. A violent scuffle erupted on the audio, the sickening sound of flesh hitting wet wood, the heavy thud of a body being thrown down, and Nolan gasping for air as the ligature was violently tightened around his wrist, pinning him directly against the rigged electrical pedestal. I closed my eyes, the tears burning hot against my cold skin, but I refused to turn the recording off. I owed it to him to hear every single second of his war. In the chaotic, desperate seconds before the lethal surge of electricity was triggered, Nolan stopped fighting the physical restraint. His breathing slowed. When he spoke his final words, he did not direct them at Avery, or Dean, or even the man listening on the phone. He spoke them to the dark, knowing exactly who would eventually find the recording. If I do not make it out of here, Faith will see the math you cannot bury. A terrifying, deafening crack of raw electrical voltage violently shattered the audio feed. The recording dissolved into a chaotic hiss of dead static, and then absolute, suffocating silence. I sat completely motionless in the metal chair. The devastating sorrow that had crushed my chest for 18 long months was entirely incinerated by those final words. My husband did not die begging for his life. He died leaving me a map, utterly confident that I was brilliant enough and ruthless enough to burn their entire empire to the ground. When I finally stood up from that table, I was no longer a shattered woman looking for a grave to weep over. My spine was forged from absolute iron. Laurel Price did not waste a single second of the momentum. Armed with the irrefutable audio evidence and the massive financial dossiers I had compiled, she moved with terrifying federal precision. She cornered Councilwoman Adrienne Pike in her private legislative office just before midnight. Laurel dropped the meticulously documented ledger of illegal campaign finance transfers and offshore political action committee bribes onto her mahogany desk. Faced with the absolute certainty of spending 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, the untouchable politician completely shattered. Pike signed a full, unredacted cooperation agreement before the sun came up, officially confirming a decade of systemic police suppression and municipal blindness bought and paid for by Ridge Corps. The dominoes were violently colliding now. Grant Lyle was the next to break. Trapped by the Federal Election Commission and staring at his own financial ruin, my former mentor desperately attempted to save his own skin by throwing his corporate masters to the wolves. Grant surrendered a massive, highly encrypted cache of internal executive emails. The digital correspondence explicitly proved that the vicious, public smear campaign against my husband was heavily premeditated. Hollis Wynn and his board had actively conspired to brand Nolan as mentally unstable weeks before they murdered him, ensuring their lucrative stock valuation would remain perfectly insulated from the fallout of his accidental death. Every single layer of their invincible armor had been systematically stripped away in the dark. Now, the sun was rising on a Monday morning. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my hotel room, dressing for a funeral they did not know they were attending. I put on a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal suit. I pulled my hair back into a severe, unforgiving knot. I slid the heavy, encrypted flash drive containing every shell company, every rigged electrical schematic, every bloody financial transfer, and the final audio recording of a murdered man into the breast pocket of my jacket. I drove downtown and walked through the soaring, cathedral-like glass doors of the Ridge Corps corporate headquarters. The massive building hummed with the arrogant energy of untouchable wealth. The security guards in the lobby recognized me as the grieving widow. They gave me sympathetic, pitying nods and scanned my visitor badge without asking a single question. They had absolutely no idea they were letting a bomb step into the elevator. I rode the glass elevator up to the executive penthouse level. The polished marble hallway was eerily quiet. At the far end of the corridor stood the massive double oak doors of the primary boardroom. Inside that room, the emergency board of directors meeting was already underway. They were sitting around a massive mahogany table, holding expensive pens, fully preparing to sign the authorization forms for a refinancing package worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They thought they had successfully buried their sins under concrete and silenced the only man who knew the truth. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung shut behind me. 12 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Hollis Wynn, looking perfectly relaxed in his bespoke navy suit. Beside him sat representatives from the massive international banking syndicate, their pens literally hovering over the final authorization documents for a refinancing package worth over $400 million. Avery Cole sat to Hollis' right, acting as the lead corporate counsel, his face draining of all color the second he saw me standing there. "Ms. Stewart," Hollis said, his voice dripping with condescending patience, "this is a closed executive session. If this is about your late husband's life insurance disbursement, I assure you our legal department will handle it by 5 o'clock today. I walked directly to the center of the room. I am not here for an insurance check, Hollis, I said smoothly, my voice echoing off the glass walls. As the legal executor of Nolan Stewart's estate, I currently hold his unvested executive voting shares, according to your own corporate bylaws. Section 4, Paragraph 2. That grants me 3 minutes of uninterrupted speaking time before any major financial vote. Hollis leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He smiled a thin, arrogant smile. He actually thought I was going to stand there and weep. By all means. Faith, the floor is yours. I reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out the encrypted flash drive, and slid it into the central presentation console. The massive digital screen behind Hollis instantly flared to life. I did not waste a single second on grief. I hit them with pure, unadulterated forensic mathematics. The documents you are about to sign are predicated on massive, systemic fraud, I announced, looking directly at the lead banking underwriter. Ridgecore has spent the last 3 years purchasing thousands of tons of gutted, highly dangerous electrical switchgears from condemned Nevada casinos. They funneled the hardware through 3 anonymous shell companies registered in Wyoming, slapped counterfeit inspection labels on the rusted steel, and charged the city for brand new equipment. The boardroom erupted into frantic murmurs, but I raised my voice, cutting through the noise like a scythe. I clicked to the next slide, displaying the internal reconciliation spreadsheets Tessa Vance had provided. You are currently underwriting the refinancing of 6 municipal housing towers, I continued, staring down the bankers. Those buildings are wired with explosive traps. My husband discovered it. He found the original acceptance photographs showing the degraded serial numbers, which you can see on the screen right now. He also found the forged safety certifications signed by Dean Kessler, who has been receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal bribes from this very corporation. Hollis slammed his hands onto the table. This is completely absurd. Turn that screen off immediately. Avery, call security and have this hysterical woman removed from the building. Avery tried to stand up, his hands trembling violently, but before he could speak, the heavy double doors at the back of the room opened. Laurel Price stepped into the boardroom, flashing her federal badge. Nobody is calling security, Laurel stated coldly. At exactly 9 o'clock this morning, federal marshals initiated simultaneous raids on this headquarters, the private offices of Dean Kessler, the personal residence of Avery Cole, and 2 off-site storage facilities located in the industrial district. The absolute, paralyzing panic finally hit Hollis Wynne. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by the pale, rigid mask of a trapped animal. But I was not finished. I had to deliver the final blow. I pressed the last button on the presentation remote. The audio recording I had captured in the short-term rental apartment echoed through the boardroom speakers. Avery's voice filled the room, clearly admitting that Hollis only wanted to teach Nolan a hard lesson, and that Dean Kessler was the one who wired the dock to send a lethal current. Avery violently backed away from the table, his chair crashing to the floor. He looked at the furious, terrified faces of the board members. Hollis immediately turned on him, pointing a shaking finger. You acted alone. Avery, you were his lawyer. You orchestrated this entire nightmare to protect your own equity. I did exactly what you ordered me to do, Avery screamed, completely shattering under the pressure. The polished corporate lawyer dissolved into a frantic, desperate coward. You told me to set up the meeting on the pier. You told Dean to rig the power pedestal. You were on the phone listening to it happen. That is a lie, Hollis roared. Is it? I asked softly. I triggered the second audio file. The room fell dead silent as the chaotic, terrifying sounds of the Blackwater Marina filled the air. They heard the violent struggle. They heard my husband fighting for his life against the wet wood. And then, clear as a bell, They heard Hollis Wynn's voice projecting through the speakerphone, asking if the problem was contained, acting as the absolute director of the execution. The lead banking representative practically lunged across the table to snatch the refinancing contracts away from Hollis. He pulled out his phone, his face pale with rage. "This deal is completely dead. I am freezing every single line of credit your company holds, effective immediately." A second later, the corporate secretary's tablet chimed. The primary surety bond insurer had officially withdrawn their backing. Ridgecore was financially decapitated in less than 2 minutes. Dean Kessler did not even make it out of the building. We received word through Laurel's radio that federal agents had tackled the corrupt inspector in the basement service hallway as he desperately sprinted for his car. Inside the boardroom, the remaining directors did not hesitate. To save themselves from the massive legal fallout, they hastily called for an emergency vote, completely bypassing standard procedure. They officially ousted Hollis Wynn as the chief executive officer right there on the spot. Federal marshals walked in with heavy steel handcuffs. As they read the massive list of charges, including first-degree murder, federal funds fraud, falsifying safety records, obstruction of justice, and investor fraud, Hollis looked at me one last time. He finally realized the crushing truth. The empire he built on lies and stolen money was collapsing around him, and the architect of his total destruction was the very woman he thought he had buried. The aftermath of that morning took many months to fully resolve. The city immediately condemned the dangerous public housing units, stripped out the counterfeit electrical systems, and installed safe, verified hardware. A massive victim compensation fund was established using the seized assets from the Ridgecore executives. We named it the Nolan Stewart Foundation. The federal prosecutors showed absolutely no mercy. Grant Lyle and Adrian Pike were formally indicted and stripped of all their power and influence. Avery Cole desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal by testifying against his former bosses. But the federal judge ensured he lost his law license, his entire fortune, and his freedom. He will spend a very long time sitting in a concrete cell, reflecting on the brutal cost of his betrayal. And Hollis Wynn, the untouchable king of the coast, was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He gets to spend the rest of his days watching his legacy turn to ash. As for me, I resigned from Halcyon Forensic Advisory the day after the raid. I took my settlement money and opened my own independent compliance investigation firm. I hunt the people who think they can hide their sins in the dark corners of the financial system. I never sold the house in Port Sentinel. I kept it, but I completely transformed the space. I took my husband's old, heavy office and tore the dark wood paneling down. I painted the walls a bright, brilliant white. It is now the most beautiful, sunlit room in the entire house, and the ceiling light never flickers anymore. I had the wiring completely rebuilt from the ground up. It burns steady and bright every single night. A permanent, shining reminder that the truth, when finally wired correctly, can illuminate even the darkest of shadows. Thank you so much for listening to the story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I also invite you to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.